The stale industrial lemon scent of the cleaning cart always seemed to clash violently with the ozone and recycled air pumped relentlessly through the massive supply depot at Stateside Forward Operating Base 37. Corporal Kowalski tightened her grip on the chrome handle of the mop bucket, careful not to slosh the chemical gray water onto the polished epoxy floor that Sergeant Sterling insisted had to reflect his own perfectly pressed, digitally camouflaged uniform. Kowalski was trying to negotiate for an allotment of industrial-strength degreaser, a necessary product for the maintenance hangar next door. But Sterling, perched behind his elevated Formica desk, a throne built of requisition forms and red tape, was denying her request with the detached cruelty of a bored bureaucrat. "Look, help," Sterling said, emphasizing the last word with a theatrical roll of his eyes toward the fluorescent ceiling fixtures. "I told you, the degreaser is Class A hazardous material and requires a signed Level 4 clearance from an O6. You, Corporal, are on custodial duty. You swab floors and empty bins. If you can't get the rust stains up with standard issue Pine Sol, then you're not scrubbing hard enough. Go back to the latrine, Kowalski. I have actual soldiers waiting for critical gear." Kowalski stood silently, her shoulders slightly hunched, the posture of perpetual compliance that she had perfected since her reassignment. Her utility uniform was faded, smudged with grease and coffee grounds, the uniform of necessity, not pretense. She didn't argue. Arguing with Sterling was like trying to fill a sandbag with steam. It only validated his perceived superiority. She simply looked at the stacks of pristine, shrink-wrapped MRE cases lining the shelves behind him, the overwhelming, arrogant evidence of his power to find by inventory codes. She was a ghost in the system, a utility designation, and Sterling's voice, sharp and high-pitched, was the sound of the administrative grinder trying to erase any memory that she had once been something else entirely. The air conditioner vent directly above her head began to vibrate, a low, mechanical shudder that, for Kowalski, was never just noise. It was a trigger. It was the deep, rhythmic drone of a persistent, low-flying UAV, the sound just before the silence, just before the impact. She felt the sudden, metallic taste of adrenaline flood her mouth, an involuntary reflex drilled deep into the amygdala years ago, half a world away, under a sky that actually saw stars. Fob Chapman, 2018. The memory clawed its way through the bureaucratic haze of the present moment, dragging her back with a physical, jarring pull. It wasn't a pleasant nostalgia. It was the relentless pressure of a 200-pound pack strap digging into her shoulders, the scent of parched earth mixed with diesel and sweat, and the absolute terrifying silence that fell immediately after the 12.7mm round cracked the air 5 meters to her right. She wasn't Corporal Kowalski, the janitor, then. She was Specialist Kowalski, designated marksman observer, attached temporarily to a forward reconnaissance detachment tasked with high-value target overwatch. Her world was defined by millimeters and milliseconds. Her uniform was saturated not with detergent, but with the corrosive mixture of dust, oil, and fear that never truly washes out. Her current assignment was atop Observation Post 4, a precarious, sandbagged perch built into the crumbling remains of a Soviet-era telecom tower. The sun beat down, turning the metal ladder rungs into branding irons. Her primary tool was not the industrial mop she currently held, but the Barrett M107A1, a .50 caliber anti-material rifle designed to defeat light armor and fortifications. It was a brutal piece of engineering. 11 pounds of pure kinetic energy transfer, a weapon that demanded absolute physical commitment simply to tame its recoil. Kowalski remembered focusing on her breathing, the steady, metronome beat required to stabilize the monstrous weapon. Every movement was calibrated. She had trained for months, years, internalizing the subtle, critical variables that turned a guess into an execution. It wasn't enough to know the distance, 1,842 meters to the target compound, according to the laser rangefinder data confirmed by triangulation. That was basic. True precision demanded accounting for the environment. She meticulously calculated the density altitude, factoring in the current barometric pressure, 985 hectopascals, and the 42 degrees Celsius ambient temperature, adjusting the muzzle velocity input by 0.6% to compensate for the thin, hot air. The crosswind, a steady 12 knots gusting to 15 knots from the 7 o'clock position, required a 3.1 mil hole to the left. The trajectory drop alone was 38.7 feet over that distance. Missing by even half a centimeter at the muzzle would translate to a cataclysmic deviation of over 3 meters downrange. There was no room for error. But the factor that always separated the shooters from the true marksman, the one Sterling in his plush, air-conditioned depot, ever have to consider, was the Earth itself. The Coriolis effect. The rotation of the planet meant that as the bullet traveled through the air for the requisite 3.5 seconds, the target beneath it was simultaneously rotating eastward. At that latitude and that azimuth of fire, the effect was quantifiable, requiring a fractional, microscopic shift in the scope's center point, a 0.05 mil adjustment up and slightly right.
to ensure that the projectile and the target converged precisely in 3.5 seconds' time, not 3.5 meters apart. It was physics, cold, elegant, and unforgiving. She remembered the pressure building in her ears, the metallic warmth of the brass in the chamber. She exhaled slowly, her chest emptying. The world narrowed down to the crosshair and the figure in the window. The target, confirmed, high value. She broke the shot. The sound was deafening, a visceral explosion that felt less like a mechanical discharge and more like a physical tear in the fabric of the air. The rifle's recoil slammed back, a controlled violence that rocked her entire frame, despite the massive muzzle brake. For a moment, all was chaos. The dust thrown up, the sound waves rebounding off the valley walls. Then, the confirmation chatter over the radio. Tanker down, clean hit. That was the life she was supposed to live. Precise, lethal, and essential. But combat rarely respects careful planning. 2 hours later, while the recce team was extracting, the ambush began. It wasn't the expected frontal assault. It was 3 synchronized RPG volleys fired into the flank of the main convoy route, locking down the extraction element. Kowalski, still in her sniper's nest, was supposed to be strictly an Overwatch asset, observe and report. She watched through the scope as the 4-man heavy weapons team, caught in the open, desperately tried to return fire with their HK-416s and saws against attackers they couldn't locate amidst the rapidly thickening plumes of smoke. They were pinned. A mortar team was bracketing their position, zeroing in. Kowalski didn't wait for command authorization. The decision wasn't cognitive, it was instinct, honed by months of operating on the edge. She dropped the M107A1, the anti-material rifle useless for suppression fire at close range. She grabbed her own secondary, her personalized Heckler & Koch 416 assault rifle, the weapon that felt like an extension of her own nervous system. She stripped the bolt from the M107A1, securing the weapon as per protocol, and began a rapid, controlled descent down the rusty telecom tower. She hit the ground running, abandoning her high perch and heading directly toward the fight, breaching protocol, breaching common sense, running straight into the kill zone. The roar of the fighting instantly replaced the sterile hum of the SIF's AC unit in her current reality. The air was thick with the particulate matter of pulverized concrete and spent propellant. She oriented herself by the sound of the heaviest suppression fire. Her 4 teammates was sheltered behind a shattered Humvee chassis, barely holding on. Kowalski didn't try to flank the enemy. She did the unexpected. She sprinted directly toward their known firing positions, utilizing the thickest smoke cloud as cover. She fired a full 30-round magazine in controlled bursts, not aiming for specific targets, but aiming for maximum psychological disruption, targeting the sound signature she'd been tracking. The distinctive crack of her HK-416 firing 5.56mm NATO rounds mixed with the higher-pitched pop of the enemy's AKs. She reloaded mid-stride, dropping the empty Stanag magazine and slamming a fresh one home with a practiced violence that had saved her life countless times. The key to her survival wasn't bravery, it was speed and suppressing fire density. By drawing their attention onto herself, a single, fast-moving target emerging suddenly from the smoke, she relieved the pressure on the 4 men trapped behind the Humvee. The enemy, startled by the sudden appearance of a lone soldier seemingly running into their lines, hesitated just long enough. That hesitation was the window of opportunity. As she emptied her 3rd magazine, providing a wall of deafening, indiscriminate suppressive fire, she heard the call over her comms, distorted by the noise. "Moving, we're moving." She had bought them 15 seconds. 15 seconds to break contact, to scramble onto the incoming quick reaction force vehicles. 15 seconds that meant the difference between evacuation and triage, between life and being tagged for body recovery. She felt the searing heat of enemy tracer rounds zip past her head, the smell of burnt cordite almost overwhelming. She took a single grazing hit to her left shoulder, a deep, painful slice from shrapnel thrown off by a round impacting the dirt next to her boot. She ignored it. Pain was just an administrative detail.
Once the 4 men were loaded and the QRF had established a proper defense perimeter, Kowalski finally broke contact, retreating with the same controlled urgency she had exhibited running forward. She returned to the relative safety of the rear, her uniform shredded, her rifle overheating, her shoulder bleeding steadily, but her 4 teammates alive and accounted for. She later learned that the 4 she saved included the team's medic, their JTAC controller, and 2 key intelligence analysts. Their survival prevented a catastrophic operational failure that day. The citation written for her actions was long, dense with bureaucratic terminology, but the core fact remained. She had voluntarily and unilaterally moved through heavy enemy fire to successfully draw attention away from pinned comrades, saving their lives at extreme personal risk. The resultant shrapnel injury, however, had done too much damage to the subscapular nerve bundle. Despite surgery and months of grueling physical therapy,
Her body could no longer reliably manage the minute muscular precision required for long-range marksmanship under duress. The military, recognizing her sacrifice but acknowledging her limitation, had honorably discharged her from combat roles and reassigned her to a civilian utility position, allowing her to stay connected to the rhythm of the base, the life she understood, even if it meant scrubbing floors instead of saving lives. The Medal of Valor, the highest award for military heroism, was pinned discreetly inside a drawer back in her small barracks room. She never wore the rack. She preferred invisibility. The vibrating AC unit stopped suddenly, pulling Kowalski violently back to the present. The smell of Pine Sol and Sterling's cheap cologne replaced the scent of burning oil and propellant. Her hands, calloused and strong, were resting on the handle of the mop cart. "Did you hear me, Kowalski?" Sterling snapped, irritated by her silence. "I said, if you're too inept to clean a floor, perhaps you should just stick to brewing the coffee. That's about the limit of your technical competence, isn't it?" He swiveled his chair back and grabbed a massive, glossy copy of the base personnel registry, flipping through it dismissively. "It's people like you with this entitlement mentality who clog up the supply lines," Sterling continued, leaning back, the epitome of unchallenged superiority. "You want industrial-grade chemicals for a job that a corporal with a bucket can handle. You think just because you put on a uniform, you deserve the best gear. Real soldiers, Kowalski, the ones who actually deploy, need these resources, not the maintenance staff." Sterling had crossed the line. He hadn't just insulted her current job, he had implicitly dismissed her entire history of service, labeling her as a drain on the system, a non-essential functionary, suggesting her sacrifice was less valuable than his management of inventory. Kowalski felt a cold, dull anger begin to pool in her gut, a heavy stone replacing the brief flash of adrenaline. She opened her mouth, ready to issue a professionally restrained but cutting defense of her necessity. Before she could utter a single syllable, the massive, thick steel door leading to the skiff hissed open behind them. The transition from the brightly lit, sterile supply depot into the deeper shadows of the skiff corridor was abrupt, but the sound of heavy boots on the polished floor was unmistakable. The man who emerged was not just a soldier, he was a force of nature condensed into human form. He was Chief Miller, a chief petty officer attached to SEAL Team 6, known globally by the silent designation DevGru. Miller was a legend, visible in the way his custom-fitted Cry Precision combat uniform sat on his massive frame. His gear was sparse but functional, all worn with the easy familiarity of tools that have seen years of brutal use. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, his attention focused immediately on Sergeant Sterling, whose arrogance seemed to shrivel under the intensity of the chief's gaze. Miller wasn't there for the argument. He was there for a highly specialized rush order requisition that Sterling had foolishly been delaying for 48 hours. Sterling instantly snapped to attention, his carefully constructed bureaucratic wall crumbling. "Chief Petty Officer Miller, sir, we have your—" Miller silenced him with a single, slow lift of a scarred hand. His eyes didn't leave Sterling, but his body language shifted almost imperceptibly as he took in the scene. The slumped, silent corporal, the mop bucket, and Sterling's inflated chest. "My package," Miller's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, the sound of static electricity in mountain weather, "is delayed because the requisition form had a typo. Is that correct, Sergeant?" "Yes, Chief. The NSN code for the optical stabilizer on the thermal scope was transposed. Highly sensitive, mission-critical equipment, Chief. I can't release it until the paperwork is fully ratified by—" "Paperwork."
Miller cut him off again, the word laden with contempt. He finally took a step closer, reducing the space between himself and Sterling, using his sheer physical presence to dominate the sergeant's airspace. Sterling actually began to sweat, the color draining from his face beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Miller's gaze flicked past Sterling, briefly landing on Kowalski. He wasn't assessing her uniform or her mop. He was assessing her bearing, the almost military stiffness with which she held herself despite the filth of her work, and the faint, almost invisible fading of the service ribbon rack pinned barely visibly above the breast pocket of her utility shirt. It was dusty, scratched, and lacked the polished, synthetic sheen of parade decorations. But Miller didn't need sheen. He needed data. Kowalski had done an exceptional job of keeping her achievements invisible, often removing the most obvious ribbons and relying solely on the faded ones that merely denoted longevity of service. But the highest award she possessed, the Medal of Valor, was represented by a tiny, almost oxidized patch of light blue, white, and gold, tucked carefully beneath the more mundane National Defense Service Medal. Miller's eyes, trained to identify critical details at immense distances, registered the color configuration immediately. He didn't ask Sterling for her file. He didn't need the paperwork. He simply knew. He turned his focus entirely back to Sterling, his voice dropping to a dangerous near whisper that forced Sterling to strain to hear. "Sergeant Sterling, what is your rank?" "Sergeant Chief, E5. "And how long have you been in service?" 9 years, Chief. All stateside logistics, exemplary service record." Sterling puffed his chest slightly, attempting to reclaim some dignity. Miller nodded slowly, then pointed one thick, calloused finger, a finger that had squeezed the trigger on thousands of rounds of high-explosive ammunition, at Kowalski. "And this corporal? Her name is Kowalski. Do you know her service record, Sergeant?"
Sterling scoffed softly, genuinely bewildered by the detour. No, Chief. She's the help, maintenance. Frankly, she's wasting my time arguing about degreaser. The silence that followed was immense, heavy enough to warp the sound waves in the room. Chief Miller straightened to his full height, which was considerable, and performed a slow, deliberate physical rotation until he was facing Kowalski directly. Kowalski met his gaze, not with fear, but with a weary acknowledgement. She knew exactly what he was about to do. She had spent years trying to bury this identity, but the chief was about to exhume it, not cruelly, but as an absolute requirement of respect. Miller didn't salute her, as they were both technically enlisted. He did something far more devastating. He began to read her. His voice, while still a low rumble, took on a rhythmic, authoritative cadence, reciting the military language of citations, not from a file, but from the recognition burned into the collective memory of the combat-hardened community. Corporal Kowalski. Her official rating is utilities maintenance, yes, but her prior specialty code was 19D, Sniper Observer, High Altitude Engagement. She served 4 tours in high-risk zones, Sergeant. 4 tours where the nearest supply depot wasn't air-conditioned, but rather 200 kilometers away, accessible only by air, and routinely targeted by indirect fire. Sterling's face was turning the color of ash. He tried to interrupt, stammering, "Chief, with all respect, I didn't know." Miller ignored him completely, his eyes locked on Kowalski. On 11 August 2018, near FOB Chapman, Specialist Kowalski broke protocol, abandoning her high-value position, a position of relative safety, and actively moved under heavy enemy fire into a hot zone. Miller gestured sharply to the faint, almost invisible ribbon rack on her chest. The ribbon she wears most proudly as the standard-issue service ribbon, the one she tries hardest to hide, is the Medal of Valor. "Sergeant, do you know what that medal is awarded for?" Miller didn't wait for an answer. The Medal of Valor is awarded for acts of gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty, while engaged in action against an enemy of the United States. It requires confirmed, documented evidence of facing certain death to save others. She did this when she performed suppressive fire for 15 critical seconds, drawing a 3-man ambush team onto herself, allowing 4 members of a heavy weapons element to be safely evacuated. He paused, letting the weight of the sacrifice hang in the sterile air. "She saved 4 lives that day, Sergeant. 4 lives that included a medic and 2 critical intelligence assets. Those lives were purchased with shrapnel to the subscapular region, which is why she is now assigned to custodial duty, because she can no longer maintain the muscular stability required for precision marksmanship. She didn't quit. She was broken doing her job, protecting people like you."
Miller took a final, heavy step toward Kowalski, bypassing Sterling entirely. His voice softened marginally, shifting from the harsh tone of command to the quiet respect shared between warriors who understand the true cost of the uniform. "Corporal," he said, addressing her officially, his voice clear and resonant. Kowalski simply nodded, gripping the mop handle tighter. Miller then performed the ultimate silent act of recognition. He reached to the sling of his shoulder and detached the primary weapon he was carrying, a highly customized Heckler & Koch 416, chambered in 5.56 by 45 mm NATO, the same base platform Kowalski had relied on in her moment of desperate action at FOB Chapman. This was not just a rifle. This was Chief Miller's personal instrument, a piece of equipment that had traveled the world with him, a witness to countless missions. It was worn down to the metal in certain spots, near the safety selector and where his cheek always rested on the stock, but meticulously maintained. The custom Gaiselli trigger felt feather-light. The optic, a Trijicon ACOG, was secured with industrial precision. The entire weapon smelled faintly of bronze dust and break-free CLP, the scent of active duty. Miller cradled the rifle in his hands, presenting it to her, muzzle down, in the classic gesture of trust. "I am late for extraction, Corporal," Miller stated, his eyes boring into hers, demanding acknowledgement of the ritual. "I cannot enter the SIF carrying a live primary weapon. I need someone I trust, absolutely, implicitly, with my life, to hold this for me for exactly 3 minutes while I sign for my gear." He didn't offer it to Sterling. He bypassed the supply chain manager, the bureaucrat who claimed superiority. He offered his most sacred object, his rifle, his life, to the woman Sterling had just dismissed as the help. Kowalski's eyes widened only infinitesimally. She knew the weight of the gesture. To a soldier of Miller's caliber, the primary rifle is an extension of the soul. Handing it over is the ultimate declaration of trust, the absolute and unconditional acceptance of the recipient's competence, loyalty, and warrior status. Miller held the weapon out, waiting. Kowalski carefully placed the mop against the wall, its chrome handle clicking softly against the concrete. She wiped her right hand on her utility trousers, despite the pointlessness of the action. Her hands were permanently stained. She reached out and accepted the HK-416. The rifle settled into her hands perfectly, the familiar weight, the specific balance of the piston-driven system. It was heavy, comforting. For a fleeting second,
The scent of the CLP and the cold steel in her palms transported her fully back to the dust and adrenaline of Fob Chapman. Her stance shifted involuntarily. Her shoulders straightened, her head came up, and her eyes adopted the distant, hyper-alert focus of someone monitoring a 360-degree perimeter. The Corporal Kowalski who scrubbed floors vanished, replaced by the specialist Kowalski who bought time with blood. The room, the brightly lit, sterile supply depot, fell into a deep, profound silence. Sterling stood frozen behind his desk, his jaw slack, his face now a sickly, mottled white. He saw the transformation in Kowalski, the shift from a compliant service worker to a hardened, armed operator, and the reality of his mistake hit him with the force of a high-velocity impact. He wasn't just insulting a corporal. He was insulting a decorated war hero, openly and repeatedly, directly in front of an elite operator who knew the definition of sacrifice. Miller leaned in close to Kowalski, speaking directly into the space between them, low enough so Sterling couldn't possibly hear the specific words, but loud enough to ensure he heard the intimacy of the exchange. "Keep your fingers straight and off the trigger, Corporal," Miller advised, the hint of a genuine smile touching the edges of his scarred mouth. "And for God's sake, don't let it touch that nasty mop water." Kowalski held the rifle steady, her arms perfectly relaxed, perfectly professional. "Acknowledged, Chief. 3 minutes. I'll keep the brass clean." Miller nodded once, a gesture of finality, and turned to the requisition counter. He finished his paperwork in precisely 180 seconds, signing the required Level 5 clearance forms for his specialized thermal scopes. When Miller returned, he didn't snatch the rifle back. He walked slowly up to Kowalski, his hand outstretched. Kowalski handled the transfer with the same fluid economy she used to fire it under pressure. She presented the weapon, butt first, securing the exchange with a shared, silent nod. Miller slung the HK-416 across his chest. He didn't look at Sterling. He didn't need to issue a threat or a reprimand. The silent, absolute validation of Kowalski's worth was the only punishment necessary. Sergeant Sterling, still pale and trembling, finally found his voice, high and thin. "Chief?"
I apologize. I had no idea about Corporal Kowalski's previous assignment." Miller paused at the safe door, turning just his head to look at Sterling one last time. His eyes were cold, devoid of emotion, the gaze of a man who dealt in certainties and hated excuses. "Sergeant," Miller stated flatly, his voice echoing slightly in the vast room, "she is not defined by her previous assignment. She is defined by the blood she shed for her country, which she shed so that desk jockeys like you could argue over the price of degreaser in air-conditioned comfort. You see a mop. I see a medal of valor. Learn the difference. It might save your career." Miller didn't wait for a response. He pushed through the heavy steel door, which hissed shut behind him, leaving the supply depot suddenly silent, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly over the wreckage of Sergeant Sterling's ego. Kowalski retrieved her mop, her posture returning instantly to the slightly hunched anonymity she wore so well. She glanced briefly at Sterling, who sat slumped in his chair, staring at the Formica desk as if trying to calculate the exact moment his life had imploded. His career, built on regulations and paperwork, was likely over. Chief Miller's report on his lack of respect for combat veterans would be filed, quietly, lethally. Kowalski simply pushed her mop cart past the desk. She didn't press for the degreaser again. The victory had already been secured. She walked out of the supply depot, back into the hangar, leaving Sterling alone with his humiliation, carrying only the scent of pine sol and the faint, lingering metallic memory of the HK-416 in her hands. If you believe respect is earned by blood and not by rank, type respect in the comments.